Let's get it. Esther 1. And it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, bro, that sounded like a dinosaur name. Ahasuerus looking. He is the Ahasuerus who reigned from Hodu to Cush, 127 provinces in those days. When King Ahasuerus, whatever the fucking name is, sat on his royal throne, which was in Shushan, the capital. In the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials and his servants, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles and officials of the provinces being present, when he displayed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his splendorous majesty for many days, 180 days. And when these days were fulfilled, the king made a 7-day feast for all the people who were present in Shushan, the capital, great and small alike, in the courtyard of the garden of the king's palace. There were hangings of white, fine cotton, and turquoise wool, held with cords of fine linen and purple wool, upon silver rods and marble pillars. The counters of gold and silver were on a pavement of variegated marble. The drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of diverse form, and royal wine in abundance in accordance with the king's wealth. And the drinking was according to the law. There was no coercion, for so the king had established for every officer of his house to do according to each man's pleasure. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal house of King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he told Mehuman, Bezetha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zathar, and Carcass, the 7 chamberlains who attended King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king adorned with the royal crown, to show off to the people and the officials her beauty, for she was beautiful of appearance. But Queen Vashti refused to come, at the king's command conveyed by the hand of the chamberlains. The king therefore became very enraged, and his wrath burned in him. Then the king spoke to the wise men, those who knew the times, for such was the king's procedures to turn to all who knew the law and judgment. Those closest to him, Karshina, Shathar, Admatha, Tarshish, Merez, Marsina, and Mamukan, the 7 officers of Persia and Media who had access to the king, who sat first in the kingdom. By the law which should be done to Queen Vashti for not having obeyed the bidding of the king Ahasuerus, conveyed by the hand of the chamberlains. Mamukan declared before the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but against all the officials and all the people in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's deed will go forth to all women, making their husbands contemptible in their eyes, when they will say, King Ahasuerus said to bring Queen Vashti before him, but she did not come. So she started the feminist movement, huh? And this day the princesses of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's deed will speak of it to all the king's officials, and there will be much contempt and rage. If it pleases the king, let there go forth a royal edict from him, and let it be written into the laws of Persia and Media, that it not be revoked, that Vashti never again appear before King Ahasuerus. And let the king confer her royal estate upon another who is better than she. Then the king's decree which he will proclaim shall be heard throughout all his kingdom, great though it be, and all the wives will show respect to their husbands, great and small alike. Yeah, this sound like this thing started the feminist, masculine, female virus. This proposal was favorable in the eyes of the king and the officials, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. And he sent letters into all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each people in his own language, to the effect that every man should rule in his own home and speak the language of his own people. 2. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, and what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's attendant said, "Let there be sought for the king young maidens of beautiful appearance, and let the king appoint commissioners in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they gather together every young maiden of beautiful appearance to Shushan the capital, to the harem, under the charge of Haggai, the king's chamberlain, guardian of the women, and let their cosmetics be given them. Then let the girl who pleases the king reign in place of Vashti." The matter pleased the king, and he did so. There was a Jewish man in Shushan the capital whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shammai, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been exiled from Jerusalem, along with the exiles who had been exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had exiled. And he had reared Hadassah. She is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The maiden was finely featured and beautiful of appearance, and when her father and mother had died, Mordecai adopted her as his daughter. So it came to pass, when the king's bidding and decree were announced, and when many young maidens were being brought together to Shushan the capital, under the charge of Haggai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace, under the charge of Haggai, guardian of the women. The girl was pleasing in his eyes, and she found favor before him. He hurriedly prepared her cosmetics and her allowance of delicacies to present to her, along with the 7 attendants of the king's palace. And he transferred her and her maidens to the best quarters in the harem. Esther had not told of her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her not to tell. Day after day, Mordecai would walk about in front of the courtyard of the harem to learn about Esther's well-being and what would become of her. Now when each maiden's turn arrived to come to King Ahasuerus, after having been treated according to the law prescribed for women for 12 months, for so was the prescribed length of their anointing accomplished, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and feminine cosmetics. And when the girl came in this manner to the king, she was given whatever she requested to accompany her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she will come, and in the morning she will return to the second harem in the charge of Shaashgaz, the king's chamberlain, guardian of the concubines. She would never again come to the king unless the king desired her, and she was summoned by name. Now when the turn came for Esther, daughter of Abihail, uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as his daughter, to come to the king, she requested nothing except that which Haggai, the king's chamberlain, guardian of the women, had advised. Esther would find favor in the eyes of all who saw her. Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebes, or Tevez, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found more favor and kindness before him than all the other maidens, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. Then the king made a great banquet for all his officers and his servants. It was Esther's banquet. And he proclaimed an amnesty for the provinces and gave gifts worthy of the king's hand. And when the maidens were gathered together the second time, and Mordecai sat at the king's gate, Esther still told nothing of her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had instructed her. For Esther continued to obey Mordecai, just as when she was reared by him. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's chamberlains, of the guardians of the threshold, became enraged and sought to send their hand against King Ahasuerus. The matter became known to Mordecai, who told it to Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. The matter was investigated and found to be true, and they were both hanged on the gallows. It was recorded in the book of Chronicles in the king's presence. Chapter 3. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and elevated him. He set his seat above all the officers who were with him. All the king's servants at the king's gate will bow down and prostrate themselves before Haman, for so had the king commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow and would not prostrate himself. It sounds like me. And it's funny because Mordecai, I think it's the equivalent to my name, which means warrior or like a protector. So the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Now it happened when they said this to him day after day, and he did not heed them. They told Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would prevail, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman himself saw that Mordecai did not bow down and prostrate himself before him, Haman was filled with wrath. However, it seemed contemptible to send his hand against Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. So Haman sought to destroy all Jews who were throughout the entire kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, that is the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman from day to day and from month to month to the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your realm. Their laws are different from every other people's, and they do not observe the king's laws. Therefore, it is not befitting the king to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let it be recorded that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 silver talents into the hands of those who perform the duties, for deposit in the king's treasuries." So the king removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, enemy of the Jews. Then the king said to Haman, "The silver is given to you, the people also, to do with as you see fit." The king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and everything was written exactly as Haman had dictated, to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over every province, and to the officials of every people. To each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus, and it was sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by courier to all the provinces of the king to destroy, to slay, and to exterminate all the Jews, from young to old, children and women, in one day, on the 13th of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. Copies of the documents were to be promulgated in every province and be published to all peoples, for them to be prepared for that day. The couriers went forth hurriedly by order of the king, and the edict was distributed in Shushan, the capital. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was bewildered. Chapter 4. Mordecai learned of all that had been done, and Mordecai tore his clothes and donned sackcloth and ashes. He went out into the midst of the city and cried aloud in bitter cry. He came until the front of the king's gate, for it was forbidden to enter the king's gate in a garment of sackcloth. And in every province, any place the king's command and decree was extended, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and lament. Sackcloth and ashes were spread out for the masses. And Esther's maidens came, as well as her chamberlains, and told her about it, and the queen was greatly distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai, and to remove his sackcloth from upon him, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had stationed before her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was about and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai to the city square, which was in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him of all that had happened to him, and all about the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay to the royal treasuries for the annihilation of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the decree that was distributed in Shushan for their destruction, so that he might show it to Esther and inform her, and bid her to go to the king to implore of him and to plead with him for her people. Hathach came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Then Esther told Hathach and ordered him to return to him Mordecai, saying, All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court who is not summoned, his law is one to be put to death, except for the one to whom the king shall extend the gold scepter so that he may live. Now I have not been summoned to come to the king for these past 30 days. They related Esther's words to Mordecai. Then Mordecai said to reply to Esther, "Do not imagine in your soul that you will be able to escape in the king's palace any more than the rest of the Jews. For if you persist in keeping silent at a time like this, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another place, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether it was just for such a time as this that you attained the royal position." Then Esther said to reply to Mordecai, "Go, assemble all the Jews that are to be found in Shushan, and fast for me, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I with my maids will fast also. Thus I will come to the king, though it is unlawful. And if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then left and did exactly as Esther had commanded him. Chapter 5. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, Esther donned royalty and stood in the inner courtyard of the king's palace, facing the king's palace, while the king was sitting on his royal throne in the royal palace facing the entrance of the palace. When the king noticed Queen Esther standing in the courtyard, she found favor in his eyes. The king extended to Esther the gold scepter that was in his hand, and Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. The king said to her, "What is it for you, O Queen Esther? And what is your petition? Even if it be until half the kingdom, it shall be granted you." Esther said, damn, I can't read. Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him." Then the king commanded, "Hasten Haman to fulfill Esther's word." So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. The king said to Esther during the wine feast, "What is your request? It shall be granted you. And what is your petition? Even if it be until half the kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." So Esther responded and said, "My request and my petition. If I have found favor in the king's eyes, and it pleases the king to grant my request and to fulfill my petition, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and tomorrow I shall fulfill the king's word." That day Haman went out joyful and exuberant. But when Haman noticed Mordecai in the king's gate, that he did not stand up and did not stir before him, Haman was filled with wrath at Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. He sent and summoned his friends and his wife, Zeresh. Haman recounted to them the glory of his wealth and of his many sons. And all the ways in which the king had promoted him and elevated him above the officials and royal servants. Haman said, "Moreover, Queen Esther brought no one but myself to accompany the king to the banquet that she had prepared. And tomorrow, too, I am invited by her along with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." So his wife Zeresh, as well as all his friends, said to him, "Let them make a gallows 50 cubits high, and in the morning speak to the king and have them hang Mordecai on it. Then accompany the king to the banquet in good spirits." This suggestion pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. I'm gonna need y'all to read for me, man. Chapter 6. That night, the king's sleep. Hold up. Yeah. The night the king's sleep was disturbed. So he had commanded to bring the book of records, the chronicles, and that they be read before the king. And it was found written there that Mordecai had denounced Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains of the guardians of the threshold, who had sought to send their hand against King Ahasuerus. The king said, "What honor or majesty had been done from Mordecai for this?" The king's attendants, his ministers, said, "Nothing has been done for him." The king said, "Who is in the courtyard?" Now Haman was just coming into the outer courtyard of the royal palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. So the king's attendant said to him, "Behold, Haman stands in the courtyard." And the king said, "Let him enter." Haman entered, and the king said to him, "What should be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" Now Haman said in his heart, "Whom would the king especially want to honor more than me?" So Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king desires to honor, have them bring royal attire that the king has worn, and a horse upon which the king has ridden, one with a royal crown placed on his head. Then let the attire and the horse be given over into the hand of into the hand of one of the king's most noble officials, and let them dress the man whom the king desires to honor, and have him ride on a horse through the city square, and let them proclaim before him, 'This is what shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the attire and the horse as you have said, and do all this for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not omit a single detail of all that you have suggested." So Haman took the garment and the horse and dressed Mordecai and had him ride through the city square and proclaimed before him, "This is what shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor." Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried home, despondent and with his head covered. Haman told his wife, Zeresh, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. And his wise men and his wife, Zeresh, said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will undoubtedly fall before him." While they were still talking about him, the king's chamberlains arrived, and they hurried to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. 7. So the king and Haman came to feast with Queen Esther. The king asked Esther again on the second day at the wine feast, "What is your request, King Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your petition? Even if it be until half the kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." So Queen Esther responded and said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted to me as my request, and my people as my petition. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to be exterminated. Had we been sold as slaves and maidservants, I would have kept quiet, for the adversary is not worthy of the king's damage." Thereupon King Ahasuerus exclaimed and said to Queen Esther, "Who is this? Where is this one who dared to do so?" And Esther said, "A man who is an adversary and an enemy, this wicked Haman." Haman trembled in terror before the king and queen. The king arose in his wrath from the wine feast and went into the palace garden, while Haman remained to beg Queen Esther for his soul, for he saw that evil had been determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the hall of the wine feast, Haman had fallen into the couch upon which Esther was. So the king exclaimed, "Would he actually assault the queen while I'm in the house?" As soon as the king uttered this, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the chamberlains in attendance before the king, said, "Furthermore, the gallows which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good for the king, is standing in Haman's house. It is 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger abated. Chapter 8. Shalom. That very day, King Ahasuerus gave the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told the king what he was to her. The king removed his signet ring, which he had taken away from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther put Mordecai in charge of Haman's estate. Esther yet again spoke to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and implored him to avert the evil attention of Haman the Agagite and his scheme that he had plotted against the Jews. The king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and Esther arose and stood before the king. She said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor before him, and the proposal seems proper before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, Let it be written to countermand those dispatches, the scheme of Haman the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, in which he had written to exterminate the Jews who were in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to witness the disaster which will befall my people? How can I bear to witness the extermination of my kindred? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Haman's estate to Esther, and they have hanged him on the gallows, because he sent his hand against the Jews. You may write concerning the Jews whatever is favorable in your eyes, in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's signet. For an edict which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet may not be revoked. So they summoned the king's scribes at that time, in the third month, which is the month of Sivan, on its 23rd day, and it was written as Mordecai had dictated to the Jews and to the satraps, the governors and the officials of the provinces, from Hodu to Cush, 127 provinces, to each province in its own script, and each people in his own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. He wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet. He sent dispatches by couriers on horseback, riders on swift mules, bred of mares, to the effect that the king had given permission to the Jews of every city to organize and to defend themselves, to destroy, to slay, and to exterminate every armed force of any people or province that threatened them, along with their children and women, and to plunder their possessions. Hold on. On one day, in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, namely upon the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, copies of the document were to be promulgated in every province, and be published to all the peoples, for the Jews to be prepared for that day, to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers, riders of swift mules, went forth in urgent haste by word of the king, and the edict was distributed in Shushan, the capital. Mordecai left the king's presence, clad in royal apparel of turquoise and white, with a large gold crown, and a robe of fine linen and purple. Then the city of Shushan was cheerful and glad. Hold up. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, every place where the king's word and his decree reached, the Jews had gladness and joy, a feast and a holiday. Moreover, many from among the people of the land professed themselves Jews, for the fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. Chapter 9. Then in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, in the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were about to be enforced, on the day that the enemies of the Jews expected to prevail over them, and it was turned about, the Jews prevailed over their adversaries. The Jews organized themselves in their cities and all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to send forth their hand against those who sought their hurt, and no man could stand before them, for fear of them had fallen upon all the peoples. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps and the governors and those that conduct the king's affairs, exalted the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. For Mordecai was now preeminent in the royal palace, and his fame was spreading throughout all the provinces. For the man Mordecai grew increasingly greater, and the Jews struck at all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, slaughtering and annihilating. They treated their enemies as they pleased. In Shushan, the capital, the Jews slew and annihilated 500 men. In Parshandatha, in Dalphon, in Asapha, in Poratha, in Adalia, in Aridatha, in Parmashta, and Arissa, and Arada, and Vyasatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Jews' enemy, but they did not lay their hands on the spoils. The same day, the number of those killed in Shushan, the capital, was reported to the king. The king said to Queen Esther, in Shushan, the capital, the Jews have slain and annihilated 500 men. as well as 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? What is your request now? It shall be granted you. What is your petition further? It shall be fulfilled. Esther replied, if it pleases the king, let tomorrow also be given to the Jews who are in Shushan to act as they did today, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. The king ordered that this be done, and a decree was distributed in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. The Jews that were in Shushan assembled again on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and slew 300 men in Shushan, but they did not lay their hand on the spoils. The rest of the Jews that were in the king's provinces assembled and defended themselves, gaining relief from their foes, slaying 75,000 of their enemies, but they did not lay their hand on the spoils. On the 13th day of the month of Adar, and they gained relief on its 14th day, making it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews that were in Shushan assembled on both its 13th day and its 14th, and they gained relief on its 15th, making it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, Jewish villagers who live in unwalled towns celebrate the 14th day of the month of Adar as an occasion of gladness, feasting, and festival, and for sending delicacies to another. That'd be Purim. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, near to the near ones and the distant ones, charging them to observe annually the 14th day of the month of Adar and its 15th day, as the days on which the Jews regained relief from their enemies, and the month which had been turned about for them from one of sorrow to gladness, and from mourning to festival, to observe them as days of fasting and feasting and gladness, and sending delicacies to one another and gifts to the poor. The Jews undertook to continue that which they had begun, just as Mordecai had prescribed to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, enemy of all the Jews, had plotted to annihilate the Jews and had cast a lot to terrify and to annihilate them. But when she appeared before the king, he commanded by means of letters that Haman's wicked scheme, which he had devised against the Jews, should recoil on his own head, and they hanged him and his sons on the gallows. Therefore they called these days Purim, from the word pur. Therefore, because all that was written in this letter, and because of what they had seen concerning this, and what has happened to them, the Jews confirmed and undertook upon themselves, and their posterity upon all who might join them without fail, to observe these 2 days in their prescribed manner and in their proper time each year. And these days shall be remembered and celebrated by every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And these days of Purim should never cease from among the Jews, nor shall their remembrance perish from their descendants. Then Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, wrote, along with Mordecai the Jew, with full authority to ratify this second letter of Purim. Dispatches were sent to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to establish these days of Purim. Shut up. On their proper dates, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had enjoined them, and as they had confirmed upon themselves and their posterity the matter of the fast and their lamentations. Esther's ordinance confirmed these regulations for Purim, and it was recorded in the book. 10. King Ahasuerus levied a tax on the mainland and the islands of the sea. All his mighty and powerful acts and the account of greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are recorded in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia. For Mordecai the Jew was viceroy to King Ahasuerus. He was a great man among the Jews, and found favor with the multitude of his brethren. He sought the good of his people and spoke for the welfare of all his seed. That concludes Esther. I gotta call my brother real quick. Shalom.